Hi, boys and girls. Welcome back to our March Missions Project. So this is our fourth and final week. So I hope you've had fun. I've had a lot of fun looking at the life of Abraham. So we're going to continue with Abraham for the first part of this video. And then at the end, we're going to look at the story of Buster for Buster's Big Adventure Part 5. All right, so we're going to continue with Abraham. We're saying that he is the first missionary. Now, the Bible never says, Abraham, you were a missionary, but we see him doing things that a missionary typically does. So let's take a look. What did God tell the first missionary? Well, we say that God told Abraham three things early in Abraham's life. The first thing is he told Abraham to go. Abraham had to get up, he had to leave his family, he had to leave his house, and he had to leave his home country. But as he did those things, God said, I will bless you. I'm going to take care of you, Abraham. I'm going to give you land, and I'm going to give you a great big family. But we've had 3 weeks of looking at Abraham, and Abraham still does not have any children. But finally, the last thing that God told Abraham is that Abraham was going to turn around and he was going to bless other people. In fact, it says that Abraham is going to bless every family of the earth. A pretty amazing job for the first missionary. Well, we say that Abraham did a pretty good job with the first one. He got up and he left his family, left his house, left his country. And we say that God did a very good job with number two. He blessed Abraham in many different ways. He protected him. He gave him a lot of animals for the farm that he had. But whenever we look at the third one, we say that, well, yeah, Abraham did bless other people. He prayed for Abimelech. He rescued his nephew Lot. But he also caused a lot of problems. He tried to give his wife away, pretending that it was his sister. And he did that more than once. So Abraham was an okay missionary. But let's take a look and see. Oh, I forgot one thing. We also noted last time that Abraham prayed. So this wasn't something God told him to do, but we saw this is something that missionaries do, is that they pray for other people. So how did God promise to bless Abraham? Well, he promised to give Abraham land, right? He promised to give him land. He promised to give him a lot of blessing, a lot of riches, and we see that in his collection of animals and gold and silver. But he also promised to give him a huge family as well. Now, there's a couple characters I want us to review and a couple new ones I wanted to introduce you to. So, of course, this one is Abraham, the star of the show, and this is his wife, Sarah. So, Sarah, but there's another two characters I want to introduce that have actually been going along the story of Abraham that I didn't tell you about, but we're going to look at them today. The first one is Hagar. Now, Hagar is a servant of Sarah, and the other one is Ishmael. This is Ishmael. So we're going to take a look and see where Hagar and Ishmael come to be. All right, so several years earlier in our story, Abraham and Sarah were living. Now, they were quite old. Abraham was 85 years old, older than most of your grandpas and grandmas. And Sarah was still pretty old as well. She was 75, probably older than your grandpa and grandma. But they still did not have any children. Well, Sarah was quite upset by this and bothered. How can I have children? I'm too old to have kids. I don't want to have kids at this age. And Abraham felt the same thing. He was 85 years old. He didn't want to wait any longer. So Sarah had a good idea in her mind anyway. She thought, well, I have a servant named Hagar. Hagar is much younger than I am, and I'm sure she would make a good wife for Abraham. So Sarah recommended that Abraham have a second wife, this one, Hagar. It wouldn't be the same as Sarah. Sarah would still be the number one wife, but Hagar would be the number two wife. Abraham should have said, absolutely not, I'm not going to do that. But Abraham agreed with Sarah, and Abraham went and he got married to Hagar as well. Well, Hagar eventually had a son named Ishmael. So Ishmael was the son of Abraham, but not the son of Sarah. God promised to give Sarah a son. Well, Sarah mentioned this idea for Hagar to get married to Abraham because she thought it would bring her peace and she thought it would be good. But in actuality, it only made Sarah angry. And from that moment on, well, Sarah and Hagar, they were in a constant battle. Sarah was always upset with Hagar, and Hagar always felt bad because Sarah was mean to her. Well, now that kind of catches us up to Genesis 21. So we're going to go back to Genesis 21. I want you to keep that idea in your mind of Hagar versus Sarah, of Ishmael and Sarah not really liking Ishmael. Well, last time we saw that Abimelech was scared of Abraham because he almost married Abraham's wife. Well, whenever Abimelech realized this, he said, all right, take the land and get out of here. Take whatever land you want. I am leaving. So Abimelech leaves, but then Abraham had this great piece of land. He was able to choose where he wanted to live. So Abraham set up a tent, and this was where he was going to make his home. He decided to live in this tent with his wife Sarah, and he had surrounding tents with other servants, and that's where Hagar and Ishmael lived. Well, after many, many years, 15 years from the time of Ishmael's birth, guess what happened to Sarah? God gave Sarah a baby. They were so happy. I mean, she's almost 90 years old. Abraham's like 100 years old, and finally they get a baby. The faithful promise of God comes to pass, and they think, what should we name this child? Well, Sarah thought back to the scene where God came and said, you're going to have a baby, Sarah, and Sarah laughed. So Sarah wanted to name the baby Laughter, or the name Isaac, which means laughter. So the baby boy was named Isaac, and Isaac grew up. And whenever he was going to have a very special birthday party, a birthday party where he was weaned, he was able to eat his own food and probably able to walk and maybe even talk a little bit, they had this great big feast. Well, a feast is supposed to be a time of celebrating, but they didn't really have pure celebration. Ishmael laughed at Isaac. He said, look at this little doofus. He thinks he's something so special. I'm like 14 years old now. This little guy, he's like still a baby. Well, again, this made Sarah very angry. She had waited so long to have a child, and now somebody she didn't like anyway was complaining about her son. So she went and she complained to Abraham and said, all right, I want you to take Hagar and Ishmael and I want you to kick them out of the tent. They can't be with us any longer. Oh, Abraham felt terrible. He felt sick to his stomach. He loved Ishmael and he didn't want to see his son go. But he listened to Sarah and he sent them away. He said, here, take this glass of water, take this loaf of bread, and I want you to go. He sent them out into the desert, but a loaf of bread and a glass of water, it just doesn't last very long in the desert. They ran out of supplies, and Hagar felt terrible. Well, her son started to feel weak. She didn't want to watch her son die, so she sent her son away and said, look, get away from me. I can't watch you die out here in the desert. Hagar felt terrible, and she began to cry, thinking, oh, what have I done? I didn't do anything wrong, but I'm about to die. I'm going to have to watch my son die. This is horrific. Well, about that time, God came and spoke to Hagar. God said, what is wrong, Hagar? And Hagar began to complain to God and tell her all of her problems. And about that time, God lifted Hagar's eyes, and she was able to see a well off in the distance. She called to her son Ishmael, and they ran to the well as fast as they could. They began drinking water as fast as they could. Well, they felt revived after the water, and God spoke to them one more time. God said, I will bless Ishmael. And he blessed Ishmael. See how he has a bow and arrow? Well, God made Ishmael so good with a bow and arrow, he became this great hunter. So they always had a supply for food. And eventually, Ishmael met a wife in Egypt and was able to start his own family. Well, now we have to go back to Abraham. Abraham had sent his son and his second wife away, but Abraham does something good at the end of this chapter. You see, he goes back to Abimelech, the guy that he had scared before and had done all of these bad things to. Well, Abraham counts out all these lambs and he says, Abimelech, I am really sorry that we got off onto the wrong foot. I want to give you this gift. So I'm going to give you all of these sheep and we can still be friends. I'm really sorry for what I've done to you, but here you go. I want to bless you with these sheep. Well, of course, Abimelech was excited. He got these sheep, and now he had a good relationship with Abraham. Abraham blessed Abimelech. And after that, Abimelech went his own way, and Abraham planted this great, big, massive tree that grew. And this is where Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac lived for the rest of chapter 21. Whenever Abraham had set up this tree, Abraham called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. God made a promise to Abraham that he didn't fulfill for 25 years. God is an everlasting God and he's not bound by time. So Abraham set this tree up and he began to worship God. Calling on the name of the Lord is like prayer. So Abraham prayed and he worshiped God in this land. Now, as always, we have to give Abraham our score. Well, we have to say, did Abraham go? Well, overall, yes, Abraham went and he traveled, but we don't really see him traveling in this episode. Did God bless Abraham? Well, here we could give a great big massive tick. Yes, God blessed Abraham, and God gave Abraham the son Isaac, the son that he'd waited for so long. In our last question, did Abraham bless other people? Well, on the one hand, we can say, yes, he gave Abimelech these sheep and he set up this relationship, or he restored the relationship. So, yeah, he was a blessing to Abimelech. But what about to Ishmael and Hagar? On the other hand, he sent them out into the desert. And that was really difficult. That wasn't a good thing. He shouldn't have had a second wife. So we can say, yeah, Abraham did good, but he also did bad. So he's not the perfect missionary. Well, now we asked before, how did God bless or promise to bless Abraham? Well, we see that he has land, that he can finally plant a tree, set up his tent, and establish a little bit of a home. But the ultimate promise came with a son. His son Isaac was finally born after 25 years of waiting. But whenever we think of the great son Isaac, that actually pushes us to think of an even better son, a better missionary, the ultimate missionary, Jesus Christ. Jesus was in heaven, but he came down, he became a human being, and he saved us. He died on the cross for our sins so that we could have life. He was the true promised son that in turn was going to bless all of the nations. All the families of the earth are blessed through Jesus Christ, the ultimate missionary. All right, and we have part 5 of Buster's Big Adventure. But before we begin, I'd just like to do a quick review because we got a bunch of characters floating around. Well, we have our star of the show here. We have Buster, and Buster's best friend is Tony. And after Tony, we have Prince Edmund. And Prince Edmund was the son of the great King Gregory. And I put a question mark here because we have still not seen King Gregory. And last couple weeks ago, I think in part 3, we met this guy who is named Marcus. Now, Buster and Tony separated ways. Buster kept going by himself. Tony went with Marcus. But Marcus betrayed Tony and traded him in for money. And who has Tony now? Well, we have 2 characters you didn't really meet last time. You got to see them, but you didn't learn their names. The first one is Hagar. He's the first ogre. And the second ogre is Igor. Hagar and Igor have Tony. Well, now it's time for Buster's Big Adventure, Part 5. Let me make my picture a little bit bigger. All right, so we need to jump back in to Tony's story before we catch up to Buster. Well, like last time I told you, Marcus loved money. And Hagar and Igor, they gave all this money to Marcus because Marcus would trap little boys and little girls with all of his fancy toys, with Nerf guns, and with his big house. Well, Tony was sold into slavery to these 2 gross-looking ogres. Of course, it was terrifying, and they put him in a great big cage. Ha 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 ha, said Igor. I can't wait to eat this little boy. Well, said Hagar, we need to wait and build a fire. Last time I ate a boy uncooked, I had a very serious tummy ache. So we need to go build a fire before we can eat this boy. Oh, all right, said Igor. And the ogres picked up Tony in the cage and they went off to find a good place to build a fire. Well, they went off into the woods and there they were going to build a fire. But remember, there was dark rain clouds in the sky, and a great drop hit Igor on the head. Hey, what was that? Did you hit me, Hagar? I didn't hit you, said Hagar. That's just rain. Don't you see it coming down now? Oh, no, said Igor. Can you build a fire when it's raining, boys and girls? Absolutely not. Even idiots like Hagar and Igor know that you can't build a fire. So they decided to wait. So they kept carrying Tony through the woods all night. Eventually, they started shaking the trees closer and closer as they got to Buster. Boom, boom, boom. With all this racket and the shaking of the trees, Buster woke up and came out of the cave. There was one great big final shake of the trees, and then the horrible ogres appeared. Buster was terrified. He'd never seen such big and ugly creatures. But then, through the midst of them, he could see his best friend Tony in the cage. Oh no, thought Buster. What are these disgusting ogres going to do with Tony? I can't believe that wasn't a dream. They really have Tony. Well, Buster went and he hid behind this rock. He didn't want any ugly ogre to see him. Buster just watched. He saw that the ogres were going into the woods and out of the woods, and they were collecting great big logs. Buster didn't know, what are they doing with these great big pieces of wood? But then he saw that flames started to emerge from the logs. Oh no, thought Buster, the ogres want to cook Tony and they want to eat him. So Buster went back into the cave and he got a slingshot and his rocks. He looked at them and thought, these are so tiny and the ogres are so big. What can I do with this tiny little slingshot against these massive creatures? Well, Buster didn't know what else he could do, so he just decided to launch one of these rocks and kapow! He nailed Igor right on the head. Hey, said Igor, why did you hit me, Hagar? I didn't hit you. I'm collecting firewood and getting ready for dinner. Well, then what is this rock on my head? It wasn't me. You probably hit yourself. Buster couldn't help but giggle at the two dumb ogres' conversation. Well, Buster decided to take one more rock and launch it again at Igor. Pow! Hit him right in the head again. Hey, said Igor, why'd you hit me in the head? I didn't hit you in the head. I told you I'm getting ready for supper, said Hagar. Well, Igor wasn't listening to this any longer. He decided he was going to take the stone into his hand and he was going to chuck it, pow, right at Hagar. But he didn't hit him in the head. He hit him right in the eye. And ogres hate getting hit in the eye. They hate that more than anything else. Well, after that, it was on. In walked Igor versus Hagar. They were in for a battle. Igor took his club and he swung it back and he hit Hagar as hard as he could. Kapow! Well, Igor wasn't having that. He took his sword and he swung it and kabam! Hit Igor as hard as he could. Well, both of the ogres were stumbling. They took their weapons. They both swung them back at the same time. And 3, 2, 1, they let it go and boom! They smashed each other in the head as hard as they could. Both of the ogres fell back and all they saw were stars and birds swirling around their heads. Buster couldn't believe the simple slingshot worked. He ran down from the cave, down the mountain, and over to Tony. He took the cage that Tony was in, found the keys, opened it up, and threw it off of his pal. The two of them were so excited to see each other. Tony thought that he was about to be ogre meat, and Buster thought he was going to have to continue the journey by himself. All right, and that is the end of part 5. The end of part 5. All right, there's only 6 parts. So this means 6 in Hong Kong. They would do this for 6. So there's a 6th part that we're going to have tonight at Kids Club. So I hope you can join or you can watch the video later today. So here's a final message from Buster. I hope you can come to Kids Club tonight to see what happens next. So I hope you boys and girls can make it and see what happens to Buster.